So thank you so much for joining us both in person and virtually, and thank you for taking some time on this very lovely Friday afternoon to learn a little bit more about the patent system. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share with you a little bit about the history of patenting in the United States. We're going to do a pretty high-level overview, so this might be review for some of you, but hopefully we have some interesting stories that maybe you haven't heard before as well. So to start, let me see if this works. Yep. Why do we study history, and specifically, why do we study the history of the patent system? What can learning about intellectual property in America's past teach us now? Well, I'm a little biased because it's my job, but I think it's very important that we study what came before because that can reveal a lot about how we engage with questions now and how the work we're doing now is going to be seen in the future. And there are some key lessons that we can learn from studying patents in America's past. So first off, not all inventions were immediately world-changing. Most inventors are not your Thomas Edisons or your Alexander Graham Bells who invent a pinnacle thing that changes society forever. Most inventions build upon each other. So they're incremental improvements on previous technologies that culminate in things that change the world. Another lesson that we can learn is that we can better understand what was important to people in the past and the questions they were seeking to solve by looking at their patents, looking at their inventions, and determining why they were trying to invent that thing or solve that problem at that particular time. It can tell us a lot broadly about what people were concerned with, and that can help us look introspectively at what we're concerned with today. History also teaches us that innovation is all around us, and it always has been, even if the technologies look a little different today than they did in the past. And finally, learning about stories about past innovators and the challenges that they overcame can help inspire us today. Seeing how someone navigated challenges and overcame them to create something that made an impact on society can help us navigate our own challenges and figure out how we can create impact. So today I'm going to give a brief overview of the patent system in America, including a few key moments. But much like the history of invention itself, the history of intellectual property and the intellectual property system, there's a lot of incremental progress and small changes that culminate into something large. So to start off, I'll start with our foundation here. The foundations of our modern intellectual property system go back to the United States Constitution, just as the Commissioner said in her remarks. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 gives exclusive rights to inventors over their invention for a period of time. So this is a pinnacle moment in society. Obviously, the Constitution is as well. But the right to intellectual property is actually the only right within the body of the Constitution if you don't include the Bill of Rights. So this is something that's very much on the mind of the founders as something integrally important to this new American society. Of course, intellectual property itself is much older than the nation. So we have some examples of that. Innovation has deep, deep roots. So on the left here, you can see a seal in this kind of clay brick here. Seals functioning as trademarks, so as a marker of goods coming from a specific area or point in time. In the Harappan civilization, which existed in the Indus River Valley as early as 2500 BC. In the middle, you have an example of rubberized products. So Mesoamerican cultures like the Olmecs were producing rubber as early as 1600 BC. And finally, the printing press, one of those world-changing inventions, was first invented in the 15th century, so long before the American intellectual property system existed. What we did in America is we took it to the next level by guaranteeing the creators, the inventors, the rights to this protection. So patents existed before, but often they would belong to a monarch or an authoritarian leader. The U.S. patent system designated those rights being held by the inventor. So what did the early IP system look like? In theory, it was relatively democratized. At this time, any U.S. citizen could theoretically apply for and be granted a patent. But in practice, it was a lot more complicated than that. Not everyone had equal access to the patent system. There were financial and social barriers. And the patent system itself had a lot of work to do before it gets to what it is today. So following the Constitution outlining this right to intellectual property, George Washington himself, so the first U.S. president, urged Congress in his first State of the Union address to do something to make sure that we're offering protection for inventors. And the result was the Patent Act of 1790, the first piece of patent legislation in the United States. So following that 1790 Patent Act, the first ever U.S. patent was issued, and you have that's what you see on the screen here. It's actually signed by George Washington himself. But there's no patent office at this time. There's no examiners. There's no real infrastructure to deal with patent applications. So very early on in U.S. history, the cabinet members, so the members of George Washington's cabinet, were examining patents. That lasted about 3 years before they figured out it was unsustainable. And in 1793, Congress did away with the requirement that an invention be useful and important. So the result was between 1793 and 1836, another date we'll talk about as being very important, many patents were granted merely for following the directions and paying the fees. So it caused a lot of confusion. There's no way at this time to prove that if the patent was unique, if it would work, or even if the person applying for the patent was the true inventor. Today, patents during this period of time are known as the X patents. They can't necessarily tell us a lot about whether an invention was new or novel, but they can tell us a lot about the trends of the trends within a new nation, what's on their mind at the time. So these are two examples of X patents. They look a little bit different than the patents we're used to seeing today, as you can see. But they do tell us a little bit about, optimizing domestic work, building new infrastructure. So we have a patent for a washing machine and a zinc and copper roof. So that tells us a little bit about what's on the mind of a nation that's expanding and trying to kind of create a foothold as a pretty much brand new nation, an experiment in this time period. The Patent Office itself was created in 1802, but having a dedicated agency did very little to alleviate the concerns. For quite a while, the Patent Office had a number of employees that totaled 1. Then it went to 2. And then started to expand a little bit more than that, but again, not necessarily the infrastructure needed to really sustain a patent system forever. But eventually, lobbying by inventors, by legislators, and then by the Patent Office leaders themselves led to some positive, sustainable change. So the Patent Act of 1836, if the Constitution laid the foundation, the Patent Act built the house. This is the underpinnings of the system that we still use today. A lot has changed, but this did some very fundamental things that you still would recognize at the modern day USPTO. So one thing it did was introduce a patent numbering system. The X patents are called X patents because they were not numbered. So if you ever come across something that's patent 525X, for example, that indicates that you're dealing with a very, very early patent from before the Patent Act of 1836. It also reintroduced the examination requirement, so something that was outlined very much at the beginning, we did away with, and now it's being reintroduced. And it also, and this is key, introduced a requirement to hire professional patent examiners. So this is when the Patent Examination Corps really began. And again, it started with 1, then 2, and then kind of ballooned, and today we have over 10,000 patent examiners at the agency. It also established a library of prior art, so making sure that we could take a look at what came before, what was invented, not only patented, but invented before, to ensure that those inventions truly are new and novel. Unfortunately for the library of prior art, the earliest records of American invention burned in a fire in December of 1836. So of the nearly 10,000 X patents burned, only a little over 2,000 have been recovered. So our record of patenting in the early Republic remains incomplete. The fire also burned a large number of patent models, which were miniaturized working models of inventions required by the Patent Office between 1790 and 1870. These models still fascinate us today. If you've taken a look around the building, you might have seen some of these patent models on display. There's some more in the National Inventors Hall of Fame, which I encourage you all to check out if you have the option to do so. And this power to inspire was recognized at the time as well. So much so that when the Patent Office built its kind of first dedicated office in Washington, D.C. Today is the National Gallery of Art. We call it often the old patent office. They actually put the patent models on display. This was the first publicly funded museum in U.S. history, and it became a premier tourist attraction in the nation's capital for people visiting in the 1840s and beyond. The Declaration of Independence was actually on display at the Patent Office at in this time period. So it was not only a place of business, a place where examiners were looking at patent applications, but it was also a place where people could go to learn a little bit about the history of innovation and the history of the United States. This mid-19th century was a period of growth for the Patent Office. So they had a small but dedicated cadre of the first official patent examiners at this time. And the Patent Office's scope actually expanded in 1842 to include design patents. So we have one example of that here. Anyone recognize the figure on the screen here? Statue of Liberty. Yeah, so the Statue of Liberty, or Liberty Enlightening the World, was actually protected by a design patent in the 1870s. On your right, that is the Patent Office building in Washington, D.C. Again, the first dedicated home that the Patent Office had. And that building would remain the Patent Office's home into the 20th century. So as the office continued to grow following the Civil War, it followed trends that the larger federal government was following more widely. So the federal government, its civil service was growing, and the Patent Office was no exception. We were adding more employees to the ranks of the Patent Office. Even a second fire in 1877 could not stem this tide towards growth. Duplication procedures meant that no official records were completely lost in that fire. So we learned our lesson, basically. The 1870s saw another major expansion of the office. For the first time, someone in the United States could seek federal trademark registration for their brand. So prior to this, trademark registration was on a state-by-state level. Now you could receive a federal registration. And many of the brands that we still recognize today availed themselves of this new opportunity in the latter half of the 20th century. So you can see some of those here. If I could draw your attention to the Cracker Jack box, it very, very prominently displays the fact that it's a trademark. And that was very common at the brands at the time. It's a new system, and they wanted to highlight that new protection. This is a period of time where more Americans were seeking intellectual property protection than ever before. And it's a period of time that many historians recognize as, quote, the golden age of American innovation. Patent fees in the US were uniquely affordable at this time. So if you can see the chart here comparing them to other countries with active patent systems at the time. $35 is still quite a bit of money for a lot of people in the 1870s, but it's much more affordable than other kind of similar patent systems at the time. This is also a time where industrialization and the expansion of the American middle class meant more commercialization, more products, and more opportunity to bring products to market. Innovation also served as a method of entertainment at this time. So with massive world fairs, you can see electricity lighting up the Chicago World's Fair in this photo, and smaller demonstrations of the latest technologies, which were often given by the inventors themselves. Patents were even used in major reform movements. So this is patent examiner Henry Baker, who compiled the first list of black patent holders during his decades-long career at the Patent Office. His list was used by emerging civil rights movement as evidence of the contributions black Americans had made to the technological progress of the nation. Patents received by women inventors were frequently displayed at World's Fairs and used by the suffrage movement to advocate for the right to vote. Throughout the 20th century, inventors began filing for patents in increased numbers, and the office itself expanded to accommodate, with employees and new legislation. So beginning in the 1930s, inventors in the field of agriculture could receive a plant patent for certain varieties of plants, including some familiar to us today, like the Honeycrisp apple. In 1947, the Lanham Act provided for trademarks what the Patent Act of 1836 provided for patents. Strong infrastructure for the system we still use today. This post-World War II period also represented another boom for consumer products. New technologies and materials making mass-produced items possible on a scale not seen before in U.S. history. As they faced stiff competition in the race to bring their product to market, brands sought to protect their intellectual property through patents and trademarks. Another race, the space race, gives us a great example of how some technologies were created for one purpose and adapted to another. So the technology in our modern handheld vacuums today was originally developed for a cordless operated drill used by the Apollo missions on the surface of the moon. As our world became more connected, both physically and digitally, the latter half of the 20th century saw a rapid increase in patent applications. So compared to the 75 years it took us to go from patent number 1 to patent number 1 million, it only took us 35 months to go from 10 million to 11 million. So a rapid exponential increase in patents. And because of that, we continue to seek out ways to ensure the patent system meets the needs of a growing and changing nation. So the American Invents Act of 2011 being one recent example that established various new policies and procedures that changed the patent system in our modern era. So today we grapple with the questions that will be the subject of the history books of tomorrow. These subjects include our policy discussions, they include our educational programming, but most importantly, it's the work that inventors are doing to solve today's problems around the world. So I hope you enjoyed our brief look back at history of patenting in the United States. If you'd like to learn more, we have several resources available on our website and our other digital channels. Definitely check out our social media and our Journeys of Innovation series. And then definitely, if you have a chance, see the National Inventors Hall of Fame Museum and their website as well.